The Eastern Continental Divide intersects the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Pittsburgh Main Line at a schizure in Allegheny Mountain, formed by Flottery Creek just outside the town of Sandpatch, Pennsylvania. The Baltimore and Ohio is the nation's oldest railroad, having been chartered in 1827 and built west from the heart of Baltimore, reaching Cumberland, Maryland in November 1842. After expanding to Wheeling, Virginia and beyond, a line from Pittsburgh to Cumberland was surveyed early, and construction started under the guise of the Pittsburgh and Connellsville Railroad in the late 1840s, being quickly suspended due to lack of funds. In the early 1850s, tunnel construction commenced near Sandpatch, and to tell the story of Sandpatch, we must explore the history of 4 tunnels, 2 of which were built. The first idea for a tunnel under Allegheny Mountain came from the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, who considered reaching the Ohio River at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania via a route that closely resembled what the P&C built. The canal tunnel was anticipated to be 4 miles in length and require an abundance of locks and water to reach the proposed summit. In the end, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal never reached its intended target of the Ohio River, terminating in Cumberland in 1850. In 1854, the P&C completed the first section of what would become known as the Pittsburgh Division between Turtle Creek and Connellsville, with the railroad being completed in 1871 around Fort Hill, Pennsylvania. The east end of the Pittsburgh Division originates in Cumberland and follows the Wills Creek Valley to its headwaters near Mance, Pennsylvania, before climbing the southeastern side of a ridge paralleling Allegheny Mountain, making a sharp right-hand bend to reach the summit of the Alleghenies at 2,258 feet. Unfortunately for the railroad, a long tunnel was necessary on the eastern slope to avoid excessive curvature, as the geology surrounding Flottery Creek did not erode a deep cut through the mountain as builders had experienced numerous times with Wills Creek. Consequently, the B&O was faced with a steep grade on both sides of the summit. The second tunnel at Sandpatch was a nightmare for the B&O, with construction starting in May 1854 and suspended in April 1857. Work resumed in June 1857, only to be suspended again in September 1857. Work resumed once again in November 1865 and was suspended once more in November 1867. Starting again during September 1868, the tunnel was finally completed on April 10, 1871. The tunnel took 17 years to build, with construction taking place only over 8 years. The original plans called for a double-track bore and the builders tried hard. However, the geology required extensive timbering and supports through most of the tunnel, and all that would fit in the end was a single track. Facing a 1% approach grade, the tunnel had a length of 4,777 feet, with most overburden being 150 to 200 feet thick above the bore. 4 vertical shafts were drilled, and upon completion 3 were left open for ventilation. During the early years of the railroad, traffic was light, so the long restricting tunnel and largely single-track division was a burden that could easily be handled. Later, the slopes were double and triple tracked as traffic increased. Eastbound trains had no issue as helpers could be cut off well in advance of the portal. However, westbound trains had a real issue. Helpers had to enter the tunnel, and ventilation was a serious problem. With traffic soaring during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a solution was needed. First, a gauntlet track was installed, but that did little to mitigate the problem, with other solutions then being tried, all of which failed due to foul air conditions. Traffic numbers continued to swell to 70 trains a day, usually resulting in 2 to 3 trains being held on each side of the bore awaiting track clearance and fumes to clear. In one instance, a train was delayed over 6 hours for clearance. Asphyxiations were commonplace by train and maintenance away crews, as studies showed that trains occupied the tunnel 60% of the time during a 24-hour period. In 1910, it became imperative that a solution to the problems faced with the old tunnel be rectified, as conservative reports for the period pointed to the B&O suffering from traffic paralysis if the bottleneck were ignored, so engineers came up with plans for what was known as the Big Solution. The plan was to dig a 13,520-foot double-track bore with a 0.20% grade against eastbound tonnage, starting at a point near Glade City on the west and ending near Mance on the east. The approaches would absorb most of the estimated $4,300,000 capital investment, with a low-grade line needing to be built from a point 2 miles west of Myersdale to the west portal, and another from the east to a junction near the existing main line west of Filson. Despite the return of almost 8%, other projects were more urgent, such as the bottleneck that eventually led to the building of the Magnolia Cutoff, so the B&O settled on a small solution. In April 1911, the railroad approved a $1.3 million capital investment of a 4,000-foot double-track tunnel to be built just north of the current bore, saving roughly $3 million that could be spent elsewhere. The new Sandpatch tunnel ended up at 4,475 feet in length, costing $2,087,484, roughly half of what the Big Solution would have cost. Work began in May 1911 when 2 shafts were sunk and excavation began on both portals, and almost immediately, workers on the west portal ran into issues with geology, which, given its close proximity to the old tunnel, wasn't surprising. Original plans called for a deep cut to the west portal, about 475 feet east of its current location. However, on March 15, 1912, roughly 80,000 cubic yards of rock buried the cut. The debris was removed when on July 6, movement was detected on the south slope extending over the old tunnel, and workers fled the immediate area. On July 9th, the whole mountainside collapsed, filling the cut and also collapsing large portions of the old tunnel, facing the B&O with a serious problem. Thankfully, the neighboring Western Maryland Railway had recently been completed between Cumberland and Keystone, and all traffic was diverted over the WM for 50 days. Overburden had to be removed from the old tunnel for hundreds of feet and a new liner installed, in which over 1,000 men labored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until August 29th, when the old tunnel opened for traffic. The new tunnel had an additional 475 feet of cut and cover constructed on the west end after all the debris was cleared. The east end of the tunnel wasn't as problematic, and a concrete plant was installed at Manila to aid in construction. Manila, or GR Tower, was the eastern interlocking plant for Sandpatch, having been built in 1904 with 12 S&F levers. In 1913, GR was rebuilt with 72 GRS electric levers and lasted until 1953, when the tower was deactivated and operations were handled remotely by SA Tower. The western interlocking plant, better known as SA Tower, was located below the actual borough of Sandpatch, being built in 1899 with 6 levers. SA was rebuilt again in 1904 with a 32-lever S&F plant, before being rebuilt a final time between 1913 and 1914 with an 80-lever GRS electric plant costing $63,301. SA later had a CTC board installed in 1953, and the tower lasted until its deactivation in November 2001, being raised shortly thereafter. The new tunnel opened for service in February 1913, and the B&O was finally able to see operational improvement almost immediately. A total of 1.8 miles of realignment allowed the railroad to obtain a 0.51% westbound grade, allowing helpers to cut off at Manila. As designed, the new tunnel was to handle only westbound traffic, while the old bore was to handle only eastbound traffic. However, that arrangement didn't last, as operations through the old tunnel were suspended in 1917, with the tracks being removed in 1921. The B&O officially retired the old tunnel in 1942. Today, the new tunnel is still in operation by its owner, CSX Transportation, and plays host to around 40 freight trains a day, as well as Amtrak's Floridian. Nearby, the original tunnel continues to deteriorate with the help of Mother Nature and the ravages of time. While above, ventilation shafts dot the mountaintop, symbols of what once meant life or death for some. These 4 tunnels are the history of Sandpatch and a mountain. The rectitude of the B&O, with these 2 tunnels that were ultimately built, stand as monuments to American engineering.